Hi, everyone. My name is Olka Joshi Hansen. I'm co-interim executive director of Grantmakers for Education and chief program officer. And on behalf of our team, I want to thank you for being here with us today. The issue of student performance, student academic and other outcomes, as well as assessments, are really large on folks' minds. And so we wanted to kick off a series of conversations about the future of assessment, what it could look like, with an amazing panel, which we have with us today, digging into what some of the latest educational assessments can tell us about where we can go from here. Our moderator today is going to be Dr. Heather Harding of the Campaign for Our Shared Future, and she's going to moderate a discussion between Commissioner Peggy Carr, who's with the National Center for Education Statistics, Dr. Scott Marion, who's with the National Center for the Improvement of Educational Assessment, and Paul Reville, who's with Harvard University and the Education Design Lab. The format, we will have each of our presenters presenting for about 10 to 12 minutes. Then we're going to open it up for a moderated discussion, and we would invite you to use the chat to get your questions into the mix, and we'll keep reminding you via chat as we go along. So without any further ado, I'll hand it over to Heather. Thank you so much, Heather.
Good afternoon, everyone, or morning, depending on where you are. My name is Heather Harding, as Olga said, and I'm so excited to moderate this panel today. I, a few months ago, said, where is all of the urgency around these NAEP scores coming out of a global pandemic? I run a campaign that's a nonpartisan common ground effort to defend and promote public schools now. But last year I was in the grantmaker seat. And I know that grantmakers across the country rushed forward during the global pandemic and the interruptions to learning to address student needs. And so I'm hopeful that today we can see from a panel of experts, we can talk to them about how philanthropy can really be moving forward to address the needs of our school children all across the country. And this wouldn't be new. Carnegie in 1964 made the first grant that got NAEP started. And so when we think about these issues, we know that philanthropy can really be a catalyst for this type of work. The other thing that I want to say, given the work that I'm doing with the Campaign for a Shared Future, is that I know that it's a hard time in our country right now to take bold action, given the culture wars and the political context. But I really believe that that timing makes it even more important for us to take risks and to really take seriously the need to prepare our young people for post-secondary and for college and career, for both success academically and economically, but frankly, for liberty and happiness. We really need to take up the charge of doing that work. So I'm going to turn to our first panelist, Dr. Peggy Carr, who's going to talk a little bit about what we've seen so far, what we've learned from the most recent NAEP results. Peggy, to you.
Thank you, Dr. Harding. And thank you for that introduction and a little bit of history about the NAEP program. I want to spend the bulk of my time today talking about the results from the latest National Assessment of Educational Progress, and also flavor you with some international findings out of the PISA assessment of literacy for 15-year-olds. But before I get started, I thought I would just share with your audience, I'm just going to spend a few moments talking about the National Center for Education Statistics and what we have learned in general about COVID over the past couple of years. And then I want to meander into NAEP and share with you what the world saw when we released these results back in October, and share with you what is likely to be seen out of the PISA assessment that will be released in December of this year. So next slide, please. Next slide. just go to the next slide. Well, yeah, there we go. So NCES has been around for a while. 1867, you might say. 1867, yes. We celebrated our 150th anniversary on the Hill just a few years ago. And so Congress was thinking about what we know about the nations and the progress and the condition of education many, many years ago. So the National Center for Education Statistics is one of 13 principal statistical agencies. And you know the largest, the Census Bureau, and the second largest, the Bureau of Labor Statistics. But the third largest is NCES. This is a federal statistical system, and there are many entities that collect data, but there are only 13 principal federal statistical agencies recognized by the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. NCES is also one of the oldest, but not the absolute oldest. The IRS is the oldest. Money is always important. All of the federal statistical agencies have some level of professional independence, and that's important. We are nonpartisan, but it's about statistical data that can support and provide information across all of the federal government. And in the case of NCES, that is in the area of education indicators. We produce a condition of education report annually to Congress, and we've been doing so since 1867, and it's due to them by June 1. And it tells about the condition of education for all of America. Next slide, please. So what have we been seeing? Big picture for the past 2.5 years. On this next slide, I have a real summary for you, sort of high level. Student achievement is down, and I'm going to spend the bulk of my 10 minutes or so talking about that from the NAEP data. Student absenteeism, and I want to contextualize this and talk about chronic absenteeism is up. And actually the data shows that teacher absenteeism is also up. Speaking of teachers, the data are showing that teacher vacancies, and we've been having a challenge here in the States with teacher vacancies long before COVID, but they're up more so now since COVID, and particularly for teachers of special education, students, and also for math teachers. You probably are not surprised by that. Classroom disruptions are up, and I don't mean just small, minor classroom disruptions. I mean major disruptions with fighting and verbal abuse or arguments with peers, students, peer-to-peer concerns are being seen more than prior to COVID. And also disruptions in the classrooms that are targeted towards the teachers. School shootings are up, and that's not going to be a surprise to you, but there are so many school shootings that don't make the news, and to the tune of dozens. So they're up. And bullying is up, and perhaps that's not going to be a surprise to you as well, but cyberbullying, when you dig into it, is really what we're seeing more of. And last but not least, mental health issues, social emotional learning issues amongst students. Students are asking for support in this area. Teachers are identifying the need for more support for the students and also for themselves. And the schools are doing what they can. Many of them are saying that they have upped their programmatic scope to address these issues, but there are challenges, and most notably, gaining access to certified practitioners. So that's the big issue. I now want to say a little bit about some other findings that you perhaps in the next slide, you perhaps heard on on the news. We at NCES just released during this COVID period a new methodology for taking a look into schools every month. We call it the School Pulse Panel. So monthly for the past 11 months or so, we've been going into schools, and it's based upon our concerns about pandemic impact and the recovery and the strategies that schools are partaking. So here's the big picture. 49% of the public schools K-12 reported that between 22 and 23, the school year, the beginning of the school year, students were behind in grade levels when they started in at least one subject. And you should know, mostly reading and math, particularly math. 59% of these public schools said that they utilize tailored accelerated learning strategies. You know, you have to keep students moving towards the next learning goals, wherever they are. And so tailored accelerating learning tries to do both, catch students up as well as move them forward. 37% of the schools reported that they use high dosage tutoring, and that's something I know you've heard of in the news, and many articles now have been written about this. But if done right, and we went back to the schools to make sure that we were actually collecting this data in a way that is consistent with scientifically proven most effective high dosage tutoring, there's only 37% of the schools that are really doing it. And 59% of the schools are using some form of tutoring, standard tutoring, during the 22-23 school year. So that's the big picture from our latest methodology, the School Pulse. Next slide, please. Now, I want to spend a few minutes talking about an integrated system of assessment and how you can think about NAEP and the PISA assessment, where I want to spend most of my time today, and start with putting it in context of the integrated system of assessments, because there are many ways that we assess students in this country. Next slide, please. Here's the picture. You're familiar with state assessments. All states have state accountability assessments. They are high stakes for the states, for the districts, and yes, for the students. And in some cases, students' mobility, movement towards the next grade level are associated. Those decisions are associated with state accountability assessments. That's not what I'm going to talk about today, and that is to be differentiated from NAEP and PISA. Formative assessments or process assessments that give us an indication of how students are doing in mid-course instruction throughout the school year. Many districts and states do formative assessments. They take a look at how students were performing in multiple times during the school year. So we're not going to talk about those in my talk today. And then other high-stake assessments that you're very, very familiar with are high-stake assessments for students, SAT, ACT. They are two to be differentiated from large-scale assessments. So what are large-scale assessments? And it's important before I share the results with you that you understand that there are some limitations, but some advantages to large-scale assessments as well. Next slide, please. So Bob Mislevy is sort of the godfather or grandfather, I might call him, of NAEP, would call large-scale assessments like NAEP group level assessments, and that they are dropped from the sky assessments. And they are intended to take a temperature of the school system at that moment in time. That's important because they're not following students. They may follow cohorts of students, but not individual students. In addition, these kind of large scale assessments like NAEP and TIMSS and PISA and PEARLS and PIAC, some of them, these acronyms you've heard of, only administer a portion of the assessment to the student. But when combined, we have very reliable, accurate results for groups of students, but not individual students. All of these assessments represent that what I would say is the biggest advantage, common yardsticks across states or countries, economies, where you can do comparisons, reliable comparisons. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to spend my remaining time talking about results for NAEP. Next slide, please. So NAEP is congressionally mandated. Congress has mandated NCES, Department of Ed, to collect these data, and they measure what students know and can do in a variety of subjects as indicated here on the right: reading, math, science, arts is the arts assessment is another one, U.S. history and civics. It represents a common measure of what students know and can do at the national, state, and selected district level. We have nicknamed them TUDA, Trial Urban District Assessments, and there are 27 of them. We've been doing this since 1969 at the state level. We've been doing this since 1990. These assessments, all of these assessments, regardless of the subject, are seen as gold standard assessments in large scale community because of their advanced and stellar designs and psychometrics or sampling and high quality items. Next slide, please. So I assume that you're going to get copies of this presentation, so I won't go through all of these quick facts for NAEP, but keep in mind that NAEP is a cohort assessment of students in 4th, 8th, and 12th grade. And there is also a version of NAEP that goes back to 68 that has age level cohorts of 9, 13, and 17, and the subjects as I indicated before. But reading and math are really our sort of bread and butter. The Congress decided to require that all states participate in reading and math 4th and 8th grade every 2 years. But there are other subjects that are not collected every 2 years, but they are also important, such as science. In addition, we have a 12th grade assessment, and that's generally done about every 4 years, usually in reading and math. And then there are other subjects, as I mentioned before, U.S. history, civics, and the long-term trend, which is that age base. The next time we will be in the field is in 2024. We'll collect data at the various levels, national, state, and district. And we'll also collect data that has been identified by Congress as mandated, important to provide context for the results: race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status, or a proxy of it. Students' disability status, English language learners, and geographic region and school types are other important contextual factors. We have
Dr.
other
Carr,
yes.
in the interest of time, we should get to the final, the headline of results.
Okay, let's do that. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. This is what it's been looking like. And we have been sharing with the public. And for the first time in the history of this data collection, we have shown a decline in mathematics for 4th and 8th grade. 5 points for 4th grade, 8 points, 4 points, 5 points for 4th grade, and for 8th grade, 8 points. And for reading, 3 points decline for both 4th and 8th. These are historic declines, and we were concerned about how deep these declines are. Not just a decline, but how meaningful these declines are in terms of their numerical drops. Next slide, please. Here you see a distribution of how the declines represented from lower performing 10th to the 90th percentile. And what you can see here for the 4th grade is a drop that is stronger at the bottom of the distribution where students are already struggling. Next slide, please. In addition to scale scores, we also have achievement levels set by the National Assessment Governing Board. And what's notable here is that we now have more students in the below basic range. That is not an official category, but it's a category where students have not even mastered basic fundamental skills. Next slide, please. We, as I said earlier, we have a lot of contextual variables. What this slide says is that the opportunity to learn, even during COVID, was lower for students, the lower performing students, excuse me. They just did not have access to the same resources at school, teachers, synchronous access to teachers and those sorts of important resources. Next slide, please. Now, PISA, I'll go through this very quickly. I'll just leave this slide for something for you to review later. But PISA is you can go to the next slide. PISA is a 15-year-old assessment, and it focuses on literacy, not achievement. I can explain later what that means if you're interested. But in the next animation here, you'll see that the United States ranks 31st amongst the OECD countries. These are the strongest economies across the world. 31st in mathematics. Next slide, please. This slide, you go ahead and show the animation. Will show that when you look at the top performers across the world, the United States ranks 30th. So we're not doing so good in math literacy. Next slide, please. And as a final sort of wrap up, these are the major findings of PISA over the past few years. We have been participating since the beginning, and over the more recent findings, you can see that we have not improved since 2015. And quite honestly, there has not been a lot of change since the beginning of the assessment. We rank amongst the top performers. We rank 3rd in reading literacy. We do better in reading than we do in math or science. That's something to keep in mind. And there's a pattern that I want to share that we see in NAEP, and we also see here in PISA, that there's a widening of the gap between higher and lower performing students. And then finally, our rankings internationally haven't changed that much, but one of the things that we're keeping our eye on is that other countries are leapfrogging over us. And that's why our ranking looks the way that it does, most notably. Okay, I think that's it.
Thank you, Dr. Carr. I'm gonna go right to Scott. And Scott, because these results are so alarming, I want to ask you to talk about why we continue to need them, particularly given that there's a certain reaction that would say, well, we came out of a global pandemic. Of course, the scores got hit. So tell us what they help us know and do going forward.
That's great. Thanks, Heather. So this is as a perfect lead-in, and we talk about a use case for large-scale tests. And there's no question that large-scale assessments, particularly state assessments, have gotten beaten up in recent years because they don't inform instruction. They were never really designed to, and other reasons. But large-scale tests are generally the most effective instruments for monitoring educational trends, long-term trends. We had state assessments in 2021 and 2022. We had NAEP in 2022. and they provided a critical national picture of the effects of the pandemic. Now, one of the things we talk about in our field is this two-watch problem. This means less to current generation because everybody just has their iPhone and they always know what time it is. But back in the day, you know, you had a clock on your oven, you had a wristwatch and things like that. And you always had a different time. And we talk about that. When you give two assessments, you're going to get different results. And why would we see differences between the state and NAEP assessment? And I've outlined some reasons here. One of the most important in our current context is we have different sample characteristics. In 2021, for instance, states that normally would test 95% of their kids, in some cases tested as few as 10%. We're not talking about those, but you know, 75 to 85% of your kids. And people say, oh, that sounds pretty good. It's not pretty good if all the kids who are missing are your kids with disabilities, your English learners, or your poorest kids. And so the beauty of NAEP is that it's able to ensure the consistency of the sample characteristics from one administration to another, so that we are able to draw some important inferences. I'm just going to talk very briefly about some state findings. I didn't name any states here, but we do analyses and do a lot of work for many states. You see states A through I here. This is actually in a growth metric, but it's very similar to an achievement metric. And instead of putting numbers, we just characterize these as the darkest red is severe. It's a severe impact. The little bit lighter is a large impact. You see there's other, sorry if anybody's colorblind, I apologize, moderate impacts. And in this case, we don't see any minimal or really light impacts. The lowest is moderate across the board. But what you see here is in general, and this is by grade level, 3 through 8, mathematics got hit harder than English language arts. That we saw with the commercial interim assessments, and we saw that as well with most state assessments. A lot of people are good at saying why that is, but my good friend Henry Brown is on the webinar. I see in the participants, and he has this thing of just so stories, just like, you know, Rudyard Kipling, right? We had the elephant get its trunk, or had the camel get its hump. We're good at making up stories after we see the data. But you could have predicted in some ways that most parents are not as good at math as they are saying to a kid, go read a book. And so you know, being in school really makes a difference in mathematics. This is the same idea in terms of severity, and it's hard to see, but the important thing is this is for the typical groups that we break out results for. Economically disadvantaged kids, African-American students, Asian students, white, English language learners, special ed. And it's by, importantly, there's a lot going on here, but you see look at the pattern. These are by quintiles in the distribution. So the lowest 20% of kids to the highest 20% of kids. So even across these groups, what you see is that the kids who are higher performing, no matter what ethnic or socioeconomic group, they tended to do a little bit better, and sometimes a lot better, than the lower performing kids in that particular group. So low performers, generally low performers, got hit hardest. I had a high schooler during the pandemic, and you saw it, kids with good metacognitive strategies did pretty well. They were able to manage, but a lot of kids are developing those strategies. I'm going to talk, Peggy talked about NAEP. I'm not going to go into detail about NAEP. I just want to point something out. Peggy showed this display. And so what this is that across the distribution, the kids at the 10th percentile of distribution, just what I talked about, the lowest performers, and the 90th percentile. In this case, you see pretty consistent pattern across the board, but something I'm going to come back to later. I want to show you, this is where the average score was on 8th grade math in 1990. So you could see that even in 2022, and even if you extend that back to 2019, there's still 40 to 45% of the kids now are not even scoring at the 1990s, 30 years ago, average score. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more. But we need both watches in this case. We need the state test and we need NAEP. NAEP is the only test in the country that can provide a valid national comparisons across states and these large urban districts. State summative tests can't do that. We thought we were getting there with the consortium when Park and Smarter Balance were at their heyday, but even there, we never had all the states. NAEP does that. However, if I'm going to act as a district person or a school person, sampling 3,000 to 6,000 kids in my state is not giving me enough granular information on which to act. I need the state tests that provide information at the student, school, and district levels. And that's critical for much closer in monitoring. What programs are working in my school? How is a high dose tutoring or other things, interventions we're trying working? And then I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about, while these tests are all good for monitoring, the only tests that are really useful for actually improving and supporting recovery are high quality classroom formative assessments. That's the only way that we could use assessments to improve what's going on. So this is an important, you know, we could be through with the pandemic. I like to believe that we're through with the pandemic, but the effects are still here. But this is a, you got to look a little bit closely to see what this graph is. But this is 4 scenarios of the types of recovery. So in the ideal world, and these are based on you know, what you see from the way people talk about economic downturns. So everybody loves a V-shaped recovery. And if you look here, you see, you know, we took this dip. The red line is the pandemic effect. The black line is generally where we would have been if there was no pandemic. And you could see it go down and bounce back up. That's often wishful thinking. A U-shaped recovery is when you go down and eventually climb back up to where we think students would have been. We're worried about an L-shaped recovery. It's not the only one we're worried about, where the kids drop down, they continue along at the same rate of learning as before the pandemic, but that's not good enough. Following the same rate of learning is not going to catch these kids up. And then, you know, the worst case is no recovery. They drop down and they just stagnate. The other thing we need to worry about, as they talk about this in economic recovery terms, a K-shaped recovery. What does that mean? It means some groups experience essentially a V-shaped recovery. That's the upper part of the K, and others experience no recovery. And what we often see that the differences there are due to other types of effects, like kids in poverty, or you know, it's a case of the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. Now, we have a good reason to worry about a K-shaped recovery. If you look at, I'm going to, in the second slide following, I'm going to talk about these distribution of NAEP scores on just 8th grade NAEP. So if you look at the progress we made, and I'm just focusing on 8th grade math. Actually, if you look at reading, it's very flat line since 1990, which is another story. Well, let's talk about 8th grade mathematics. You could see a steady increase from 1990 up till about 2013, and then slight declines. They weren't statistically significant declines, but slight declines until 2019, and then this really sharp drop of 8 points. We, as I should say, I'm a member of the National Assessment Governing Board, the policy board that helps guide decisions about NAEP. Everybody was worried about this. This was taking us back. You know, if you look at this, it's taking us back almost 20, 30 years in terms of where we were, and almost giving up the good gains we made in 4th and 8th grade mathematics. And it's right to worry about that. But this is something else that the governing board and NCES have been displaying for quite some time. So I'm just going to walk you through this because I want you to understand this. This lowest line are the kids scoring at the 10th percentile. This highest line, they're both different shades of blue. The highest line are the kids scoring at the 90th percentile. So in 1990, kids scoring at the 90th percentile scored about 306 or 307. Kids scoring at the 10th percentile scored about 217 or 218. So back in 2000, the difference between the 90th and 10th percentile was about 95 points. By 2019, that difference, it shrunk a little bit by 2007, 8, but never much less than 92 points or so. And then by 2019, it was up to 101 points, 102 points. And as we saw, the decline hit everyone in 2022, and it's still 101 points. Now, I think that we should be worried about those 8 points that we all lost. But we're talking about gaps that are 10 times, 11 times that decline, 12 times that decline that we saw from 2019 to 2022. That 8-point drop in the average is important, but this difference shows, and this consistent difference shows that a lot of what we've been doing, if it's been working, it certainly hasn't fulfilled the goals of ESEA and other things. So I'm going to turn it to Paul, because I know that he'll have all the answers how we could fix this, and then we'll hopefully have a good discussion. So I'm going to stop sharing. There you go.
Okay, Heather, shall I pick right up?
You sure can.
Okay, in the interest of time. So you'll be relieved to hear that I'm neither an assessment expert nor do I have any slides. I'm a practitioner. I've worked in the area at the sort of intersection of policy, practice, and research for most of my career. I'm a senior faculty member at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, where I teach courses on leadership and policy, but I've also founded an institute that I head up called the Education Redesign Lab. We call it Ed Redesign. And it's to tackle exactly the kind of issues that Scott just teed up. I served as Secretary of Education and Chairman of our Board of Education over a period of about a half a dozen years in Deval Patrick's administration. And during that period of time, and especially when I finished, I was acutely aware that as we measured results on tests like NAEP, we did extraordinarily well, leading the country in most measures at most levels for really a 20-year period, give or take a couple of ties in there. But when you looked at what was behind those averages, in other words, they were about averages, they're not about distributions. We had some of the biggest gaps in the country, and the averages concealed the fact that there were hundreds of thousands of students that weren't being adequately prepared for college or career or citizenship in Massachusetts. And so it always seemed to me that if we were going to celebrate our success in Massachusetts, it ought to be a short celebration, because we had a lot of work left to do. And when I came back to Harvard and they said, well, what do you want to do with your non-teaching time? I said, I'd like to form an institute that focuses in on the fact that we've just been through a 3-decade-long period of, well, by now it's 3 decades, by then it was 2, of intensive school reform, standards-based school reform, in which I was a major proponent and practitioner. And at the end of that period, irrespective of the declines we've been analyzing today, the major gaps, as Scott was just pointing out, that existed before we started education reform still exist afterwards. And the progress has been modest. Even though we're talking about downturns, by comparison with these overall gaps, the progress has been modest. And so we need to think about what we got wrong in terms of education reform, or as I like to think of it, as schooling reform. And if we're really interested in equity, as our rhetoric, like No Child Left Behind or Every Children Succeeds, suggests, what we ought to be doing. And my conclusion is we ought to be acting more broadly in the lives of children and thinking and changing the way in which we treat children more deeply. So there's got to be bolder, more transformational solutions. One place I start is just with what I think we've proven over this period of time, which is I think that we've proven that school reform in and of itself is necessary to improving prospects, but not sufficient for getting all of our children ready for college and career, not sufficient to close achievement gaps. Not surprisingly, students spend 20% of their waking hours in school and 80% of their time outside of school. So if we only concentrate on a school optimization solution, if we only pursue what Nation at Risk or even Horace Mann suggested we do, try and make schools the great balance wheel, the sole and exclusive mechanism in society for leveling the playing field and creating an equal opportunity society, then we've shown that schools alone, while they have done that for some people exceptionally, don't do it as a rule across the board. It's too weak an intervention on the whole. So Ed Redesign was founded to take a look at some of the other approaches that might need to be taken if we were really truly to prepare all children to be successful. And I begin with the premise that those of us who enjoy privilege in our lives know what to do in order to prepare young people to be college and career ready and successful. And the percentages of our children who get there reflect that. So it's not rocket science what we need to do, but it starts with very basic principles like meet children where they are and give them what they need, not just in school, but in school and out of school in order to make a difference in their lives. It comes with the idea of preparing a cradle to career pipeline that meets children in early childhood and gives them all the things that those of us who have privilege provide for our children that prepare them to come to school ready to take advantage of an optimized school system. Because after all, school reform is about optimizing schools. Horace Mann assumed that, if we could get everybody together in a common school and give them a common treatment, we'd have a level playing field and an equal opportunity society, but it didn't work out that way. So we need to build more broadly in order to accomplish that. So here are a couple of things that I've suggested we ought to be thinking about doing. One is we ought to have children's cabinets and think more holistically about children's lives. Now, folks like the Harlem Children's Zone or Communities in Schools or Strive Together, there are a number of organizations have been doing this work for a long while in the country, but it's been at the margins. It's not been celebrated or centered. I think we need to bring that work to the center, and I'm glad to see that philanthropy is making that possible in some places right now. I think in order to build a cradle to career system for young people, it's something that has to happen at the local level with state and national support, but it has to have guidance and leadership outside of the schools. Schools are doing everything they can. They're overloaded, they're exhausted. We're giving them more than they can handle to do more than the academic mission. We need a new social compact, and the rest of the community has to formally come to the table to help construct this pipeline. So we, for example, in conjunction with a lot of other partners in local communities, have been setting up these children's cabinets chaired by the mayors and populated by grass tops and grassroots leadership from all over the country who know how to bring the resources and programs to bear that will wrap our cradle to career pipeline of schooling, pre-K, K-12, and higher education with the supports and opportunities that affluent children take for granted. So that's one approach. We can talk about that more if time allows. A second is one of the major flaws of the legacy system of education that we have is that it's impersonal, it's one size fits all, it's teach to the average. What we need is a system where we meet every child where they are in early childhood and give them what they need inside and outside of school. For that, we proposed a mechanism called success planning, meaning every child has an individualized plan that, again, takes into account academic factors, school factors, and non-school factors that go into putting that child in the best possible place to enjoy success. So each child has a plan, and they also have a navigator assigned to them. Could be somebody like a teacher in the school system or outside the school, but an individual who gets to know that child. Each child deserves to be seen, heard, understood, and responded to, and then followed over a period of multiple years. The navigator connects with the family multiple times over the course of the year and follows the family for multiple years. We have a number of experiments going on with this work, one notably in Nashville, Tennessee, where 80,000 students now have individualized success plans, and 6,000 adults in that community, primarily teachers, are acting as navigators. So I think that those two kinds of practical interventions, and there are many more things in terms of integrated student supports that we could be doing, coupled with a stronger, broader, more sophisticated assessment system, since we're here to talk about assessment, that begins to focus more deeply on children's well-being, students' readiness for school, students' readiness ultimately to meet the kinds of challenges that they'll face in college, in work, and citizenship. We need to develop longer-term support for those kinds of assessment. In philanthropy, I think we need longer timelines. The kind of work that I'm talking about is multi-generational. And so short-term, set it up on Monday, measure its progress by Friday kind of approaches aren't going to work. And so I know a number of philanthropies are pivoting in that direction. It's an opportune time now with the federal funding on the table to make some transformational changes. I think if we can make changes like the success planning that responds to some of the needs that Peggy was talking about in terms of behavior and mental health that we're seeing in schools, students are disconnected. They need to be reconnected to their peers, to the teachers, to the school staff, to the whole endeavor of learning. If we can propose transformational changes in the world of education and child development that meet current needs that are being felt intensively because of attention to the gaps, then I think we can make the most of this opportunity. It isn't just about a technical challenge of tutoring people in academic subjects to bring them up to par. It's about rethinking our whole strategy with regard to how are we going to achieve equity with students who only go to school for 20% of their times and live in a society where we have way too much concentrated poverty and all kinds of disadvantages that get in the way of young people coming to school ready to learn. So I think it's a tall order. I think we need to think deeply about how to do it, and we need different kinds of collaborations than we've had before. So Heather, I'll stop there.
Well, you've given us a lot to chew on, Paul.
I
mean, one question I have that might draw all of you together is right now, I would characterize that there is a little bit of an attack on K-12 public education. And there are a lot of solutions. And I wanted to raise a couple of things that Paul said and Scott. One is if schooling is necessary but insufficient, how do we collect public will to make sure that we get good schools and all of the wraparound, et cetera, that we need to get to an individualized kind of approach? So I think that's one question I'll throw out and open to the panel. And then the other one is, since this is about assessment, what do we prioritize? What should get measured around these things? And how do we conceptualize assessment in different ways? So I'll just open that up.
Paul, you want to start? Oh.
Well, I mean, I'll start with a non-assessment aspect of the question, leave the other part to Scott and Peggy. I think we need leadership. We need people who have a broader vision, people who are willing to, pay attention to the results of school reform. Those results have been disappointingly modest. So we need to step back, get on the balcony, rethink what the problem is. I think there's a lot of interest. Again, I'm very hopeful in the local context of solving problems that we get into these sort of broad civil wars at the national level and the state level sometimes. But local people have to live together and work together. And I'm confident in some of the holistic work we've done. And for example, I serve on the board of purpose-built communities in Atlanta. And that organization has been very effective at bringing people together of all ideological backgrounds to focus on problems of housing, education, economic development, and health. Basic things that people, regardless of their backgrounds, feel that everybody needs, and people in local neighborhoods need a chance to do that work and be engaged in that work themselves. So I think presenting a new vision, arguing for a new social compact, and showing that it will make a difference to all of us on the route that we're going of these deep divisions, not just divisions in ideology, but divisions in income. We're on a crash course. And so I think people at the top and at different extremes need to recognize that. And we need leadership who will help bring us to work together on these issues.
Yeah, and we think about assessment or measurement. Everything doesn't have to be high stakes. And in fact, when we move things into high stakes, it becomes tougher sometimes to use them for improvement purposes. So there are a lot of the kinds of factors that Paul was talking about, kids' well-being in multiple dimensions, right? And we talked the other day about even things like grit or other types of characteristics that we know that people need to succeed. Well, we don't have to measure those on a large scale basis, but folks closer to kids should know how to be able to assess those things and then know how to be able to improve once they see. It's one thing if I say, oh, Heather, you have low grit, if that's such a thing. What do I do about it? Right. So that's what we need. We need this sort of theory of instruction and assessment to go together around some of these important skills. I'll stop.
Heather, can I jump in for just a second?
Absolutely, Peggy. Yeah.
I spoke about the Pulse survey that we are now fielding. And I can tell you in my decades of experience in collecting data for NCES, it is the first time that we heard back from teachers, from principals. Oh, I see myself in these data. Finally, someone is telling our story. And I think it's connected to what I heard Paul say. We need to have stakeholders see themselves and to be a part of the conversation. And to be part of the conversation, we need to collect data and distribute data so that their story is told. And that's what the Pulse assessment, the Pulse data collection actually does.
That's so useful. I mean, I in the work that we're doing, we definitely would underscore this notions of local community figuring out problems and addressing their problems. And I think that's really important as a parent. I mean, Paul, I know you said kids are only in school 20%, but I also think in a given day, my kids are spending a lot more time with educators. And so that road to collaborating with them and then to understanding sources of data and what they mean for how our family might address something seems important to me. I heard across the comments on the panel, advice for funders. So I heard something about time horizon. How long should funders be thinking about funding things and looking for results? And so I'm wondering, are there other things that you all, the three of you, believe that funders should be doing at this moment?
I'll give a short list of things that I mean, I think that there were a number of things that school systems were forced to do in some ways during the pandemic, that any kind of encouragement to help them continue to do those things since they've already started a change in motion. Let me just offer a few. Using technology. So, we were laggards in the use of technology. We could harness technology to improve the quality of instruction infinitely, and we have an opportunity to do that. Applied learning. During the pandemic, teachers were forced to use a lot of children's own environments and experiences as the subject of the curriculum. They could do more of that. They were forced in many cases to connect more deeply with families, just as you were just talking, Heather, and sort of reinforcing that and grants that would help people, work on that, breaking down this one-size-fits-all mentality and working more toward personalization, helping schools build relationships. No kid should go to school and be anonymous, but we haven't built schools to encourage the development of relationships between students themselves, 45 minutes somewhere else in a different class in secondary education, guidance ratios of 400. We can do a better job. So those are just a few things of a long list.
Yeah, I see Olka popped on. I mean, the biggest thing that I see is this great interest in innovation, and whether you're innovating on instructional approaches, structural approaches or assessment approaches, it's hard to innovate well in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. And so we need to think about longer term. I understand funders don't want to become the full support agency, but if we're going to ask people to do innovative stuff, they need time to figure this out. And I see Olka's on, so that must mean that's our cue.
Is no more time, Heather?
No, go ahead, Peggy, and then
You get the last word, it sounds
Yeah.
like.
Oh, okay.
Sure.
Well, it's interesting that Paul talked about, he didn't say it in these words, but are there any bright spots here that we can emulate? As daunting as these NAEP results were, if you look deep enough, there were some glimmers of hope in those data, and they were around where people at the lowest levels of performance put their shoulders together in the urban areas. For example, 8th grade reading, we saw better results despite what you say about these data, where the scores did not go down. What's up with that?
Mhm.
Why is it that the city centers could perform in a way that they could hold their own? And then there were those cases where we did see significant improvement, such as in LA. And we have to ask the superintendent there what's going on, but certainly there are some bright spots. And whatever they are, once we get in and we unpack them, take a look at them, we need to figure out how we can continue to do that moving forward.
Thank you. I love to be known as the person who, when I pop on, people are like, oh man, but
Conversation killer.
Heather, thank you for being a great moderator. Dr. Carr, Paul, and Scott, thank you. Really appreciate it. And there's a lot to talk about there, right? I'm just struck by your last point that these 10,000 foot level data are an invitation to dig in further and sort of start seeing what's actually happening underneath it. And really appreciate your thoughtful assessment of what we can learn and what we still need to know in light of these assessments. Thank you to our audience. We will have the video of this webinar available on our website in about a week, and we will link Dr. Carr's slides. And coming up, we have some other programs, a couple with our out of school time impact group, including using healing-centered engagement to address youth trauma and mental health, to the conversation we were just having. And then we do have our equity and grant making impact group. Thank you all so much for joining us, and look forward to seeing you next time. Have a great day.